On January 31st in the year 2000, two men were stabbed to death outside a nightclub in Atlanta. 24 hours later, superstar linebacker of the Baltimore Ravens, Ray Lewis, would eventually get charged for double homicide. Around 36 hours prior, two knives were purchased at an Atlanta sporting goods store. Ray Lewis was signing autographs at that Atlanta sporting goods store, and in fact, the receipt for those knives featured Ray Lewis's own name and phone number written on it. Not just that, but the star linebacker's outfit from that night mysteriously went missing and was never found again. Mayor Bill Campbell described Ray Lewis and his two friends from that night as literally dripping with blood. Witnesses say he was at the scene of the crime. In fact, so does Lewis. That's never in question. What is in question is, well, everything else. My name is Jackson Kruger. This is A Flock of Crows.
Put him in the dirt, say it again, man, and that's a reverse. Never rehearse, jumping in first. Call up the nurse, put the beat in the hearse. This is absurd, take the berserk. Don't get on the tracks, man, and they better swerve. Don't got a nerve, man, I never curse. Just casting these spells when I'm spelling these words. That's real, that's too real. I've been Roosevelt, I need a new deal.
So I feel as though I should probably start this off by answering a question many of you probably have. Why? Why talk about this? Who cares about a murder case from 20 years ago? Well, plenty of people care. I mean, for one, there's the obvious, okay, the friends and family of those murdered obviously care, of course. But aside from that, I think football fans care, right? I mean, okay, it's not exactly on the same caliber as friends and family, but still, it does matter. I mean, I spend way more time than I would care to admit mindlessly scrolling through Reddit or Twitter on football forums, and you better believe anytime a Ray Lewis thing comes up from one of his many accomplishments, every single time there's at least a few people bringing up the fact that he was charged with murder. So it's not like this is some obscure story I'm pulling out of nowhere. It's a big deal, and quite frankly, part of why I'm making this video is because I wanted this video to exist. I mean, the reality is, I didn't really know much about this entire case before actually doing the research to figure out what actually happened for this video. And that might seem a little bit crazy. I mean, I work in football. Shouldn't I have a pretty good understanding of stuff like this? But the reality is, it's a lot more difficult to find knowledge for something like this than you might expect. When I would go on like Ravens forums, say the Ravens subreddit for example, I would constantly see Lewis defenders saying things along the lines of, the only people who really think Ray Lewis is a murderer are just people who didn't really look into the story. And quite frankly, this is a key thing that people do when they defend anybody, right? It's kind of a great tactic, really, because it's implying that the people that you're against just are idiots who don't actually pay attention to this stuff, and you are the smart people who do pay attention to this stuff. However, being well read on this story is actually a lot harder than you might think. From my understanding, this trial was on court TV back when it happened, but when I tried to find the footage, I couldn't find hardly any of it. A little bit here and there, but hardly any of it. On top of that, I couldn't really find any recent articles that really get too in depth about this. I mean, there are some, but they tend to be very surface level and don't really get into too many details about this kind of thing. So I reached out personally to CNN, who has the whole footage of the trial, to see if they would send it to me, but I never heard back from them. Trust me, I flexed my whole 100K YouTube subscriber stuff trying to see if I could get a response back. Nothing. Guess I maybe at 200K they'll reach back to me. Actually, the main way I was able to make this video was by going through old newspaper articles, just reading up old things such as the New York Times and the Baltimore Sun, and really just reading articles as they happened from back in 2000. And quite frankly, it's actually a really cool and fun way to read about a story. It's almost like going into a time capsule, but then pressing fast forward once you do it. I also think for this story, it's not just a matter of have you read up on it, but a matter of when did you read up on it? Because I think that the time in which you read up on this story can vastly change how you feel about it. On the day February 9th in the year 2000, Ray Lewis woke up in jail. 10 days prior was Super Bowl 34. It was an iconic game between the Titans and Rams, if you remember. It literally came down to the 1-yard line, and prior to the Super Bowl, Lewis, like most people do, made plans. He watched the game at a place called the Colbout Lounge, a place that no longer exists. Him, along with his entourage of roughly 10 other people, left to go to their stretch limousine to leave the club. On the way there, Lewis's party got into an argument with several other men. Things escalate, 2 men end up getting stabbed to death. Quite the Super Bowl party. So what the hell happened here? Well, according to Deputy Chief Jackson, he said that witnesses saw Lewis along with other men punch and kick the victims before they were eventually stabbed to death. And Lewis, even if he didn't actually do the stabbings, could still get charged with the homicide. The several people that were mentioned in that quote are going to be key figures throughout this. The two of them are, it's really two of them that are important, Joseph L. Sweeting and Reginald Oakley, neither of which are particularly model citizens. Sweeting's record goes back to 1984. He was sentenced for a year for grand theft among at least 5 other felony convictions. Ironically enough, he was part of a gang called the Untouchables, so maybe not that untouchable. And for Oakley, his record isn't that much better. His previous run-ins with the law include convictions for embezzlement and assaulting a police officer. He was also convicted for resisting arrest. So this isn't great, but still, it's worth mentioning that this, in the eyes of the law, doesn't mean anything. In fact, it's not entirely uncommon that someone becomes a suspect in large part due to the fact that they have a previous criminal history. I would also like to mention that everything I just said, clearly wrong, but a far cry from murder. Although, at the same time, it is enough to at least get you to raise your eyebrow. Ed Garland, one of Lewis's main lawyers, he kind of is going to be the main lawyer throughout this case, he just claims that Oakley and Sweeting were kind of sports groupies. Like, okay, they were kind of friends of Lewis's friends. They weren't really that close. That might seem like just an excuse, but it does actually kind of make some sense. I mean, Sweeting and Oakley were both in their mid-30s at the time, whereas Lewis was just 25. So really, I mean, it's not the most massive age jump of all time, 6 and 9 years respectively, but it's certainly a big enough age jump to at least make you think. It just, for me at least, like makes you wonder some things, like how did you even meet in the first place with that kind of age jump? Things like that. It's at this point in the story where we should probably dive a little bit deeper into the knives. 2 knives were purchased at an Atlanta sporting goods store. That same sporting goods store Ray Lewis was signing autographs at during that day. One of those knives would end up getting considered a murder weapon. And again, Lewis had his signature on the receipt, so that's not a great look for Lewis. There's more. Those 2 knives were purchased by Sweeting and Oakley, along with a third member of the group. So that's not a great look. It's not damning, but again, not great for Ray Lewis. According to Ray Lewis's lawyer, Ed Garland, Sweeting and Oakley did purchase the knives, but Lewis was too busy signing autographs to really know what was going on, and that part to me at least seems plausible. Part of why Lewis got arrested in the first place was because apparently when he was questioned by the police, he was very uncooperative, which to some might seem like a red flag, but personally for me, I just don't see it as one. Like, I'm sorry, but it's not that crazy for someone to not give information to the police, especially when, from what I'm told, growing up a black man, you're very much told that if the police ever ask you anything, you don't give them anything. So to me, this whole Ray Lewis wasn't cooperative with the police, it's pretty irrelevant to whether or not I think he's a murderer or not. So I want to be very clear in all of this. Back in the year 2000, yes, 2 men were stabbed. There's no questioning that. But Ray Lewis didn't stab anybody. At least, nobody's accusing Ray Lewis of stabbing anybody. At no point did Ray Lewis get even accused of actually pulling off these stabbings. Well, that's just not exactly true. There was one brief moment where he kind of did. The person that briefly accused Ray Lewis of stabbing anybody was District Attorney Paul Howard, another important name to remember throughout all of this. Now, maybe even saying that Howard accused Lewis of the stabbing is a bit harsh, but he certainly heavily alluded to it. However, after more intense questioning, he did back off. Howard ended up saying, and I quote here, that whether or not he actually used the knife is irrelevant. There are witness reports that he punched and played a role in the murders under Georgia law that is enough to be considered murder. That statement is true, but only kind of, actually. It's a little bit more complex than that. So it is true, you don't actually have to murder someone to get charged with murder. Felony murder would be the actual charge, which basically means you commit a felony that in itself is dangerous and someone dies in the process, then you get charged with felony murder. It's not too different than how most people would use the term manslaughter. However, I don't really believe that this would fall under felony murder. I mean, the things that would count as something that would fall under this category are the following: burglary, arson, rape, kidnapping, aggravated assault, or cruelty to children. None of which I would really consider Ray Lewis's actions to be guilty of. In fact, back when this happened, Ray Lewis's lawyer, Ed Garland, was very much not happy at District Attorney Paul Howard for even alluding to the fact that this could be murder. He claimed they did to Lewis what was done to Richard Jewell back in 1996. Remember that story? Quite frankly, this story is one of two stories that, when doing research for this, it just seemingly kept coming up over and over again, was the name Richard Jewell. And it kind of makes some sense. So if you don't remember the story, here's the quick version. Jewell was an American security guard who helped alert police during the Olympic Park bombings at the Summer Games in 1996. This story also took place in Atlanta, Georgia, and basically what happened was Jewell saw a backpack that had 3 pipe bombs in it, and he helped escort everybody out of the area before the bombs went off so nobody got hurt. He was initially considered like a hero, as what makes sense, right? That logically follows. However, he eventually became a suspect in this scenario due to what's called as psychological profiling. Now, he did get eventually cleared of this, but not until 3 long months later, which were clearly very difficult for him. So basically the idea is, and why this keeps getting brought up, is even if you did nothing wrong, once your name gets out there as a suspect, it becomes very hard to clear your name. Part of why 20 years later, there's still people talking about it and still people making YouTube videos about it. Garland feels as though the comparisons don't end there. His claim is that Ray Lewis was only even into altercation to begin with to try and break it up, which is why the Jewell comparison keeps getting made by him. This is also why he had clear frustration at Paul Howard. However, if you want to be frustrated at Paul Howard, quite frankly, you're going to have to get in line. I think the responsible way to talk about this part of the video is to start this off by just really reiterating that just because a DA has done some reprehensible things in the past, or maybe has even shown signs that they could be corrupt, it does not mean that they are entirely corrupt. The reality is their job is typically making enemies with criminals. So even if they have in fact done bad things, it does not mean that every enemy they have is actually innocent. As the old saying goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And while I wouldn't necessarily consider a DA to have absolute power, you do kind of get the idea. Quite frankly, a lot of people that have positions of power like Howard does have checkered past, especially if you've worked as long as Howard has looked. And the reality is, criminals aren't going to like people that helped put them behind bars. So all of that stuff is totally reasonable to point out. So if a DA has something bad come out about them, we shouldn't inherently assume that their enemies are innocent. However, still, the flip side is, if Fulton County felt it was fair to look at Sweeting and Oakley's criminal past to make a judgment on them, why can't I do the same for Paul Howard? I guess what is or isn't a criminal is kind of a bit subjective, and you could argue certain gray areas, but what is in the gray area is what I'm gonna simply just put as not great behavior, which I think a lot of his stuff falls under. For example, Howard actually got fined over $6,000 for not disclosing the fact that he was actually a CEO of a nonprofit that received a ton of grant money from the city. And not just a ton as in like a few $100s, $195,000. Not great behavior. Now, I should mention that despite the fine, his innocence is maintained by not just himself, but his lawyer, Ed Garland. Yes, you heard me correctly. His lawyer, Ed Garland. The same Ed Garland that defended Ray Lewis in the year 2000 would nearly 2 decades later go on to defend Paul Howard in this situation. Kind of a wild coincidence. But quite frankly, if that was the only black mark on Howard's resume, I kind of wouldn't even bother bringing it up. There's also the sexual harassment allegations. Again, I have to be very clear here in that everything I'm about to say is completely allegations and has been denied by Howard himself. But still, we should talk about it. A former Fulton County records supervisor and paralegal claims that she was actually fired from Howard after she broke off her consensual relationship with him. She said Howard took part in, and I quote here, unprofessional, unethical, and unlawful conduct by not just sexually harassing her, but also engaging in sex acts with her. Now, this is another important thing to note of the story. She was arrested on the day of her firing, so obviously Paul Howard is simply just going to say, yeah, that's why we fired her, because of that. But again, it's worth mentioning the woman, Kathy Carter, she denies that has anything to do with the firing. She shared with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution a 21-minute long audio recording with a man that she claims to be Howard that was described as heavily flirtatious and sexual. It gets darker. She claims that District Attorney Paul Howard also pressured her into having sex in the district attorney's office, among several other places in the workplace. She also claims that when she lost her job, that is when she got fired. And she also said, and again, I quote here, there was no investigation, not even someone asking for a quote. I simply received a box of my belongings. Carter is not alone. Former Human Resources Director Tina Grimes also complained that Howard made inappropriate comments towards her. She also claimed that there was some unwelcome physical conduct and that this went on for several months. If this is true, again, I personally would say this goes well beyond not great behavior. Former Deputy Chief of Staff Jasmine Young would also go on to file a lawsuit against Howard. This one not of the sexual harassment variety, just of the she felt like she was discriminated due to being pregnant. So, yay, good, no sexual harassment. In 2020, over 200 people signed a Change.org petition to get Paul Howard removed from his position. They claimed he didn't consider all of the evidence during a felony murder charge. Again, yes, you heard me correctly. They said he didn't consider all of the evidence in a felony murder charge. Sound familiar? The petitioners cited the oath that they felt Howard did not entirely live up to, and the oath is the following. I do swear that I will faithfully and impartially and without fear, favor, or affection discharge my duties as district attorney and will take only my lawful compensation, so help me God. Now, I'm not exactly sure the Change.org position did anything, but after nearly 2 months of running unopposed, he finally had competition in the 2020 election and lost in landslide victory. What's probably an important thing to note is what happened on the date November 16th, 1999. This was the second story that kept coming up when I was doing research for this video. A man by the name of Ray Carruth was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. He would go on to spend 18 years in prison and is finally out now. You might be wondering, what's the relevance of that story to this story? Well, he was a first-round pick of the Carolina Panthers, so another NFL guy getting accused of a very serious crime, and Carruth was convicted. So while on its surface level, we shouldn't necessarily pay attention to that story and Ray Lewis's story together. They're two different people, but there's similarities, and people are people. They make these connections. So you better believe that back in the year 2000, that story was on people's minds. To talk about this story, first we should talk about what we actually know. And what we actually know is that there was basically what amounted to a street fight outside a club called the Colbout Lounge. A member in Lewis's party, Oakley, he screamed expletives at the enemy group. Ray Lewis grabbed Oakley by the waist and basically just drug him out of there. Immediately after, as Lewis and Sweeting were basically about to enter the limo, they got screamed at and egged on, basically, by the enemy group. Oakley, after hearing all of this, ran over to the opposing group and got hit in the head by a champagne bottle. Sweeting was then jumped by two men, and this is where we kind of lose the facts and start to get to things that are a bit blurry. About 90 seconds later, two men were stabbed to death, but it's that 90 seconds that we're really questioning here. On the opening day of the trial, Paul Howard announced that he would be taking the case personally, which is uncommon and definitely a bit weird on face value, but if you think cynically, it actually can kind of make some sense. I mean, if you fail to get a conviction from Lewis, everyone will just say, Lewis, superstar athlete, had a bunch of money, that's how he was able to get off, similar to how people view the OJ trial. However, if you get a conviction, that would do wonders for his personal career. Now again, I have no evidence to support that that's why Paul Howard took the case, and it's totally plausible that what he said is true, where he said that he just took it because he didn't want someone else to have to deal with the backlash, and he felt he could take the media frenzy. That's certainly entirely possible, but you have to admit it is a bit weird that a policymaker would just immediately jump into trying to take on a huge case, a murder case, especially when it's been a while since he's even been in court. It's been about 6 months. And quite frankly, after reading about how the trial actually went down, if Howard legitimately just felt he was the best person for the job, and if Howard legitimately was the best person for the job, I honestly fear for whoever else would have taken the spot. I mean, if that's true, quite frankly, it makes me wonder how bad the rest of the options were. Right off the bat, Howard made a mistake. He kind of claimed he had more evidence than he did and told the jury there'd be no doubt in anyone's mind that Lewis, Sweeting, and Oakley were definitely guilty. A friend of Ray Lewis, who allegedly witnessed the murder, was called on to the stand to face questions, but when he did, things got rather weird. During the interview, a homicide lieutenant named Mike Smith said something to the witness that was considered to be a racially disparaging comment. In a trial that's taking place in a country not exactly known for giving black people an entirely fair shake in the justice system, kind of giving evidence that the main supervisor of this crime was maybe a racist, that's not great stuff for a jury that's, 10 of which were black on that day. Again, it's what we're going to have to just throw in the box of not great behavior. Things would get worse. The next witness couldn't even say if the defendants were at the scene, and the following two witnesses that went up together, they said that the person who had the knife wasn't even any of the three of them. They put it in somebody else's hands. Okay, so now we need to talk about the alleged punch. So Gwen, one of the witnesses, said that he saw Ray Lewis throw a punch initially. However, several weeks later, he told the prosecution that he actually didn't see a punch and that there was only wrestling, no punches. When something like this happens, the prosecution has to hand that evidence over to the defense, not just because it's the ethical thing to do, but it's the legal thing to do. It's illegal not to. The prosecution did not tell the defense about this, so the drama begins. There was a definite debate about what do you do about something like this if you are the lawyers defending Lewis, Sweeting, and Oakley, and there's several schools of thought. The most traditional route would be to file a pre-trial motion about the omission, which obviously makes some sense. You could also even go with the logic of, let's just not even bring up the omission. After all, it's not the worst idea in the world for the jury to never even believe a punch was thrown in the first place. Those plans did not happen. The defense went with a different strategy. During the cross-examinations of witness Gwen, he was simply just asked, can you please recount the events that transpired the night of the killings? He was then asked if he could also recount what he told the police, and not just the initial report that he gave to them. He was also asked to talk about when he went to the scene of the crime later with the prosecution, and he was asked, what did he actually tell the prosecution in that moment? Witness Gwen talked about at trial, he mentioned the fact that back in that moment when he was at the scene of the crime, he didn't actually see a punch thrown. He told the prosecution that when he was at the scene of the crime. When witness Gwen mentioned that, the assistant district attorney told witness Gwen to simply just look at his report and underline the part of his report that he believed to be a mistake. After Gwen finished the story, the defense simply asked where a copy of the underlined statement was. There was no answer. This was considered a really big deal. I believe the technical term is an oh shit moment. The judge apparently really laid in to Paul Howard after this moment for really breaking the law, quite frankly, which again is understandable. So things were not looking great for Paul Howard, but the bright side was he was not out of witnesses. The star witness, the limo driver, Dwayne Facette, who originally said he saw Lewis throw a punch, he saw the entire fight take place, and he saw them talk about how they committed the stabbings once they got back into the limo. If this witness testimony is true, that would be a great moment for Paul Howard. The only real issue, Facette ended up going back on literally all of that. He says that none of that stuff he actually meant, and he was just simply pressured by police to say those things, which, quite frankly, is something that does happen. So think about it here. If you're Paul Howard, what do you do in this situation? I mean, from one perspective, you don't really have a case if you don't get Facette's testimony, but on the other hand, can you really risk putting him up there only for him to say he never saw any of it and now you're completely screwed? Well, no. Howard got a little bit sneaky and a little bit clever, quite frankly. If you can't call Facette to the stand, why not just call it a detective that Facette gave his testimony to? That way you can control the story in a way, and you don't have to risk Facette turning on all this stuff. It makes perfect sense. It's actually quite clever. It's also illegal, and the judge shut it down almost immediately. You see, under Georgia law, it is a law that if a witness has given unreliable testimony, you have to at least give the witness a chance to defend himself. So after that, Paul Howard kind of just dropped the Facette thing altogether. It wasn't worth the risk of putting him there in the first place. The final witness was a man named Chester Anderson, who apparently basically just made an ass of himself on the stand. He was described as a trial lawyer's dream witness by Ed Garland himself, so not like some random person. The lawyer itself said, no, he was like a dream witness. Basically what happened was Ed Garland was easily able to kind of work around and make Anderson clearly just show that he had flaws in his story and inconsistencies in his story, which is another win for the defense. It's kind of showing that the only arguments the state had, the only people that were actually pointing their fingers at Lewis, Sweeting, and Oakley were those of unreliable witnesses. This would be the end of most trials, but Paul Howard's not one to give up. To get a conviction in what would undoubtedly be the biggest trial of Howard's life, just simply due to the fame Lewis has, Howard kind of eventually realized he needs Lewis here. I mean, after all, Lewis isn't even getting accused of doing the stabbings, just kind of raising the temperature to where stabbings happened. So the chances of Lewis getting a conviction were smaller than Sweeting or Oakley. Also, Sweeting and Oakley have criminal records. Lewis does not, so that's another factor here. So, quite frankly, why not use him? Howard offered Ray Lewis a plea deal. And now, on a surface level, you might be sitting here and wondering, well, who cares? Why would you take a plea deal there? There's so little evidence, just write it out and you'll get off scot-free. But again, put yourself in Ray Lewis's shoes here. You're getting accused of murder. The potential punishment for murder in Georgia is the death penalty. Are you really going to risk your life, literally, because of how confident you feel about a trial? And it's also worth mentioning, I've heard lawyers say that the best odds they'll give somebody when you're facing a jury is 90%. You're dealing with people, and the reality is there is human error with people. There is no such thing as a foolproof trial. The reality is there's just so many ways human error can get in the way. So, do you literally risk your life for the 90% chance, or do you simply just take a step back and accept a plea deal? basically say you're not going to go to jail at all, and all you're really going to get punished for is 1 year of probation. All Lewis had to do if he accepted the plea deal was simply to plead guilty to obstruction of justice, a much lighter crime, and he had to testify against Sweeting and Oakley. Now, it's a nice thought to remain loyal to your friends, even if you weren't really that close. I mean, after all, there is a chance it wouldn't even go to a jury. The judge could just drop all the charges right away, say there isn't even enough evidence for this to go to jury, let's just drop it right now. So that's another factor in all this. But again, I keep going back to, would you really be willing to literally bet your life for something like that? Me personally, I wouldn't. I'd probably accept a plea deal. So I don't really blame Ray Lewis. And quite frankly, I think if you've never been in the situation Lewis was in, I don't know if it's entirely fair to put blame on him either. Lewis accepted the plea deal, and Sweeting and Oakley's defense were very shocked when they heard the news, because they were thinking, wait a second, we have this foolproof plan. Why would we go out and take a plea deal when there's no evidence in the first place? They went from a near guarantee that they were going to win the biggest case of their lives to a complete question. And that question, what the fuck did Ray Lewis tell the prosecution? The following day, the defense was taken into a room to view the videotape statement from Ray Lewis, and they were expecting the worst. The entire trial can basically hinge on this one videotape. However, what they ended up getting really wasn't that bad. Lewis basically just stuck to what the defense's side of the story was. So after all of this drama, Ray Lewis didn't even have to screw over Sweeting and Oakley, and he also got guaranteed safety. It's kind of a win-win. I remember in the 2012 NFL playoffs in Ray Lewis's last season, when the Ravens would go on to win the Super Bowl, there was a game earlier on in the playoffs, which was seemingly going to be Ray Lewis's last home game as a Baltimore Raven. And head coach John Harbaugh, kind of as a tribute, said, hey, we're going to kneel down now. The game is over. Why don't you run out on the field, just kind of stand behind the quarterback, just be the 11th man who doesn't have to do too much on this play anyways, and just be out there on the field. It was a tribute for all Lewis had done throughout his entire career as a Baltimore Raven. Meanwhile, back to the year 2000, this quote-unquote confession tape was basically the law equivalent of a football kneel down. The game was over. The trial did go to jury, but it didn't last long. The trial only took about 3 hours, and Sweeting and Oakley were found not guilty. So what do we make of all of this? I think firstly, it's totally fair to say that in the eyes of the law, there's just nowhere close to enough evidence to convict any of these three for any crime, really. In fact, quite frankly, there's so little evidence, it kind of personally makes me wonder, how did the trial even happen in the first place? Although this is not a court of law, and this is not a traditional trial. Ray Lewis, for the past 20 years, his issue has never been with the law. It's been with the court of public opinion. Over 2 decades later, he's still on trial. So I figure, let's reach a verdict. There is evidence that looks bad for Lewis that didn't actually make the trial. For example, there were several witnesses who initially said they saw Ray Lewis throw a punch. And it's totally plausible that the story that the defense went with, that all of these witnesses basically just simply said what the police wanted them to say, all because they felt pressured by police. That is something that does happen. Again, it's also possible they saw the punches but then went back on their word because they didn't want to be seen as a snitch. Both are totally plausible scenarios in my head. There also definitely were some, quite frankly, weird decisions made by Ray Lewis. I mean, he was wearing a white suit that night, but that white suit was never found. So kind of my first thought when I hear that is maybe it was dripping with blood and so he got rid of it. There also was blood that was in the limo that night. So again, just to reiterate, 2 men were stabbed to death. That's not up for any debate. And the 3 men accused of murder were 100% at the scene of the crime and were in an altercation right before the murders happened. The families of the victims have gone on record talking about how it's really hard for them to see Ray Lewis when he is on commercials and things like that. And Quite frankly, it makes some sense. I mean, even if you believe Lewis is innocent, imagine being a family member of someone who passed away and their alleged murderer is wildly famous. That would absolutely just really suck. But of course, we can't convict a man of murder just because the victim's family would feel better if we did. Not even in the court of public opinion can we do that. I'm not sure if Sweeting and Oakley are murderers. I'm really not. I mean, there's evidence, right? I mean, they did purchase the knives, one of which was most likely the murder weapon, so there is evidence against them. They were also heavily involved in the altercation leading up to the killings, so I can certainly, at the very least, paint the picture of them being murderers. But also, worth mentioning, that does not a criminal make. For one thing, they could have done the killings but in self-defense. That's a legitimate possibility here. Or, in fact, it could have just been someone else. Maybe they started the altercation, but it was someone else who actually had the knife and did the stabbings. In fact, that's actually a interesting and somewhat popular theory, is that a man by the name of Kwame King, who was also with them that night, he was the one who actually did the killings. In fact, remember those two men from the trial who I talked about, the two witnesses who put the knife in someone else's hands? They said none of the Sweeting, Oakland, and Lewis party even had a knife. Well, the person they said had the knife was King, so that's a possibility. In fact, any of the roughly 10 other people in Lewis's party could have done the killings. Maybe Lewis did the stabbing. It's possible. There's a chance of it. However, do we have enough evidence to get a conviction here in the court of public opinion? Not really. So, is Lewis a murderer? Well, there's a chance he is, and I would even say there's a greater than 1% chance he is. But how much greater? I'm not really sure. There just isn't strong enough evidence to really support him being a murderer. I mean, there is some evidence that he was there. In fact, he almost certainly was there at the scene of the crime, and I can even paint the picture of him potentially being in the altercation, being in the fight, and maybe even trying to help cover up the murder. All of those things are totally plausible. I don't have strong evidence to support any of those things, but again, I can paint the picture of Ray Lewis helping cover up a murder. However, I have to say, even if that's true, even if everything I just mentioned is true and Ray Lewis did all of those things, that's a far cry from being a murderer. So I guess that's my verdict. On count 1, I find Ray Lewis not guilty of murder. Count 2, I find Ray Lewis possibly guilty of getting into a fight. We'll say 50-50. Count 3, I find Ray Lewis maybe, but honestly probably guilty of covering up a murder, at least in some capacity. Count 4, I do find Ray Lewis guilty of hiding his white suit and destroying evidence that way. And finally, count 5, I find Ray Lewis incredibly guilty of being at the wrong place at the wrong time.